When we took Kong, we kidnapped their god.
An expedition to a mysterious cloud-covered island in the South Pacific finds that one resident is head and shoulders above all others, which would require an awful lot of the island's supply of Head & Shoulders anti-dandruff shampoo to avoid a snowstorm.
Kong! 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 You heard him chant that!
King Kong.
A priest gets dressed up like an ape and gets laid.
This 1976 retelling of King Kong, directed by John Guillermin, took the classic film from the 30s and updated it a little bit. But it did mainly tell the exact same story, just not in the exact same way. It's similar, but different.
We may be sailing into the history books.
Oil company executive Freddie Wilson thinks he's found a hidden island that could hold vast oil reserves, but only if his expedition gets there before anyone else. Wilson has staked his entire career on finding untapped oil fields and hurries the captain of the company's exploration ship to make ready for sail despite the extreme weather conditions. Once underway, Wilson and his chemist Roy brief the rest of the crew. There's a cloud that's in the same spot in photos taken decades apart. Some satellite photos suggest carbon levels consistent with underground crude oil deposits. It's gotta be oil.
I'm betting everything I've got on it.
However, stowaway primate specialist, paleontologist and photographer Jack Prescott announces his presence and offers an alternate explanation. It's the breath of something really big. On the way to be locked up, Jack spots a life raft and the crew discover an unconscious young woman.
D-W-A-N, Dwan. That's my name.
Dwan was on a producer's party boat in the South Pacific. She had gone up on deck while everybody else stayed in the cabin to watch a porno, which must have been pretty good since the boat blew up, leaving Dwan the only survivor, though her dreams of having to pretend she loved a movie producer in order to get work went up in smoke, as did said movie producer. Dwan and Jack will quickly become friends, and she apparently has no problems with how hirsute he is, and without being too foreshadowing, maybe she just has a type. The crew reach the island and find an unspoiled tribe behind a very large and sturdy wall. I mean, there are reasons for a tribe with no contact with the rest of the world to build a really big wall. They seem to be prepping for what looks like a wedding ceremony. There's no word on who the groom's going to be. He turns out to be Kong, a really big gorilla. I don't mean in a way you would call a gangster's muscle a really big gorilla, but an actual really big gorilla. History does not tell us who would win in a fight, Kong or Grape Ape. But I think Kong might just have the edge. He fights dirty. Kong sees Dwan and instantly takes a shine to her, abducting her and taking her back to his bachelor pad. Well, it's the side of a mountain, but it does have amenities like running water. Wilson's not all that fussed about rescuing Dwan, but Jack leads a party to try and nab her from Kong's pervy clutches. Kong is totally fascinated by Dwan, but is he looking for a hookup or is he just taking off her clothes like a Barbie doll?
You wanna eat me? Then go ahead!
Freddie Wilson has problems of his own when Roy tells him that the oil under the island still needs several thousands of years before it's usable.
Till then, you'd get better mileage filling up your Cadillac with mule piss.
Wilson then has a brainwave. Capture Kong and use him for a marketing gimmick. That's a rookie mistake. I remember the time I used an enormous 10-foot goat as a gimmick while I was handing out coupons for a local restaurant. There were many reasons why that was not a good idea, but the biggest was that the goat just ate all of the coupons. While Freddy's busy ordering bunting and balloons, most of the rescue party end up falling to their doom. Jack does rescue Dwan, while Mr. K. Kong is distracted by fighting with a giant snake. So we have one giant ape and one enormous snake. Isn't it likely that there could be other giant creatures on the island, or is it just those two? Well, as this film wasn't made by Peter Jackson, there are just the two giant creatures. Make that just the one. Kong is captured by the old giant pit filled with chloroform covered with leaves routine. Just gets him every time. He's transported back to New York in an oil tanker, and he's not all that thrilled about it, since his idea of ocean travel was informed by watching The Love Boat, and Captain Steuben isn't inviting Kong to dine at the captain's table. The big ape, that's Kong not Captain Stubing, has his mood lightened when Dwan drops in for a visit. While Jack and Dwan are bummed about abducting Kong, their principals will have to take a backseat to a paycheck, well, for now at least. Back in New York City, Jack's finally decided to quit, but Dwan is going to have her star-making performance at a tacky public event to show off Kong. Kong breaks out of his cage and runs amok in the city. Manhattan is evacuated, the bridge is mined, but Jack works out where Kong is headed, the World Trade Center, because it looks similar to a formation on Kong's island. Kong's overnighter in New York City is gonna end up a bit of a pisser. Also, Kong, despite being that big and having wet fur from swimming in a notoriously putrid river, stealthily grabs Dwan and then climbs to the top of the World Trade Center. Jack thinks he's made a deal with the authorities to trap Kong rather than kill it. Though, no one's going to take that chance. Kong is attacked by troops bearing flamethrowers and then attack helicopters. Jack and Dwan can do little but watch as Kong is killed by all the gunfire, though that fall probably doesn't help all that much. Dwan and Jack are very saddened by the death of Kong. Perhaps because for any sequel to work, the scripts are going to need some serious creative retconning in the intro, or at the very least, feature St. Francis of Assisi. Marion Cooper and Ernest Schoedsack's 1933 film, King Kong, was an iconic film that told a simple story about movie makers who find a giant primate, abduct it and take it back to New York, where it runs amok, climbs to the top of the Empire State Building, and then meets his doom after an encounter with aeroplanes.
It was beauty killed the beast.
It's almost a template for monster movies and was a landmark in terms of its intricate special effects by Willis O'Brien. Stop-motion Kong fought dinosaurs, rampaged through a miniature New York City, and interacted with many live-action elements intricately integrated into the imagery. The supersized creature terrorizing cities would be a popular subgenre of science fiction horror for decades to come, and while Kong was nominally the monster, you felt for it. Kong being killed wasn't a fist-pumping moment, unless of course you can't work out why nobody invites you over to play Cards Against Humanity anymore. While there was the sequel Son of Kong and the similarly simian Mighty Joe Young, most other giant something films went for less sympathetic monsters as antagonists. Sci-fi B-movies with big monsters played well in the 50s, but it was of course a Japanese creation that launched the kaiju genre with Gojira in 1954, and its Americanized version a few years later, Godzilla King of Monsters. Godzilla would be a huge hit, spawning sequels for years. Godzilla was originally a big meanie in some of these, but a big softie in other ones, albeit a big softie that fought other big meanies. And one of those big meanies was King Kong. There'd been a few Japanese knockoff Kong films in the 30s, but once Godzilla was established as a franchise, King Kong, or at least a version of King Kong, was popular enough to face off against Godzilla several times and even star in a few films of his own. Meanwhile, in the US, the big monster craze had subsided somewhat in the 1960s, though Kong did star in a late 60s cartoon. In the 70s, there was a renewed fascination with films about nature fighting back, often with larger than usual creatures, big ants and big spiders, and of course, very large sea creatures. Of course, remaking something never sounds like a completely original idea, but what's quite important is timing.
Yeah, all right, tough to get him to do it anyway.
If you're going to have a cycle of movies about big creatures attacking, why not include the OG? There are competing origin stories. Was it Michael Eisner's idea to mount a remake after seeing the old film? Or was it Dino De Laurentis after seeing a poster? Either story is no more interesting than having a fall in the shower and then having the revelation, oh yeah, let's remake King Kong. It was producer Dino De Laurentis who nabbed the rights to remake RKO's classic. He hired director John Guillermin, who'd had a massive hit with A Towering Inferno, and writer Lorenzo Semple Jr. to write the script. By this stage, Semple was a writer of serious fare, but he'd also played a major part in shaping the 1960s Batman series. That's called range.
You're not in a hole. That's a footprint.
Apart from some small changes to characters and motivations, the storyline hews very closely to the 1933 original. Behind the scenes, there were some legal wranglings about who had the rights to the character, but they were about as interesting as listening to the audiobook version of my accountant's memoirs.
The invention of liquid paper made my life easier. It was liquid, but it was not paper. What a marvel of the modern age.
While De Laurentis co-financed this movie with Paramount, Universal thought they had dibs and worked on their own King Kong film, which was never made, but they would later buy the rights to the RKO original and remake that in 2005. But how about that liquid paper? What a marvel of the modern age.
I bet you're an Aries, aren't you? Of course you are. I just knew it.
In updating the film, Lorenzo Semple Jr. swapped in some new elements to the story. It's now an oil company expedition led by Wilson rather than filmmakers headed by Carl Denham. Originally, the lead, Jack Driscoll, was first mate, and now Jack Prescott is a stowaway paleontologist or photographer, I forget which. Though the Fay Ray role of Anne was still aspiring actress Dwan. The actual story beats are similar. Though, curiously enough, Guillermin's film is much longer than the original, even though there are fewer monster encounters. I mean, we get a giant snake, which is cool and all if you're into snakes as large as a train, but why no dinos from Dino? And honestly, in this film, Jack doesn't really do all that much. I mean, he chases after Dwan, he manages to rescue her once or twice, but he's basically there to explain the plot. Most of the time we just cut to him looking out of breath while watching the rest of the action unfold. John Guillermin's direction is solid. This is a nice enough looking film at a time when films often looked drab. King Kong is the sort of lush looking escapist epic that really wasn't in vogue in the mid-70s. The cast in this are also way above the pay grade of most adventure films. Jeff Bridges had already been nominated for 2 Academy Awards by this point, but this is one of his earliest roles where he was the first billed lead, in a career that mixed fun adventure films with more serious fare, where he'd garner several more Oscar nominations before finally winning. You know, it's just an honour to be nominated, but no, you can't have it back. Jessica Lange made her film debut here, playing a ditzy wannabe actress, who despite being found in a life raft, is never not fully made up or remotely unglamorous. I mean, you gotta work with what you got.
You know, the all-American girl saved from an exploding yacht by deep throat.
Lange was so stung by criticism of her performance that she went and studied acting for several years before she made another film. She'd mostly stay away from playing ditzy damsels in distress in big adventure films, and as a result would end up being showered in awards. Now, I mean that metaphorically, because otherwise that could be painful. Those things are quite heavy, and they do have all of those pointy sharp bits. King Kong didn't necessarily help her career, but it did make her work for it, to the point where she would later win 2 Academy Awards for Best Actress, where there was none of this Best Supporting Actress shit. She'd take home the full cream milk.
Maybe we think of some nutty way of Kong giving away the bride.
Charles Grodin didn't often play antagonists. He usually played guys who were a bit lovable, but also a bit of a pain. Wilson is more of a pain than lovable. He's a jerk more than a villain, but he's a bit like my latest office nemesis, Brad, who insists on taking sleeping tablets whenever we have to travel for work. Normally that would be fine, but he's the only one that was insured to drive the rental car.
Here's to the big one.
Even as the film's sorta semi-human antagonist, you didn't really want to see Freddy squished into the ground. Maybe a little. Roy was played by Rene Auberjonois, along with a coterie of, oh, it's that guy, playing the various crew members. John Barry took an extended break from cranking out musical scores for James Bond films for a few years to explore some new avenues. King Kong, though, has that lush John Barry sound and is easily one of his better scores of the mid-70s.
Who the hell do you think went through there? Some guy in an ape suit?
So, a movie about a giant ape either has a lot of special effects or a really lucky casting director. King Kong is a film where the eponymous main character appears in miniature backdrops, mixed in with a few live-action elements. This Kong, however, is mostly achieved in a simpler fashion than the stop-motion Kong of the 1930s. Carlo Rambaldi was tasked with making this new version of Kong. In the finished version of the film, Kong is mostly seen as a performer in a suit, often makeup artist Rick Baker. Close-ups of Kong showed off an incredibly expressive animatronic mask. Though such were the limitations of the technology at the time, there were several masks produced where each would convey different emotions. The original plan for the film was to build a giant mechanical ape, and a giant ape was constructed at a phenomenal cost and worked so well that it's on screen for a few seconds, and those are seconds where it feels more like a contractual obligation rather than a shrewd editing decision.
This thing is just never gonna work.
Thankfully, the combination of a man in a suit and the animatronic mask works way better. The final attack on Kong, now at the top of the then new World Trade Center, is mostly well staged, though there is definitely a delineator somewhere in the film. The effects on the island hold up far better than those scenes once we hit New York City. De Laurentis didn't want any stop motion, since one of the nitpicks of the original film was the way that Kong's hair danced about from the animator's fingers brushing against the fur while the model was repositioned for each frame.
I don't know where, but I've seen this view before.
The film itself does a solid retelling of the original movie, and while it's much longer than the 30s movie, it doesn't really do much to expand the story, apart from give a lot more screen time to the characters of Jack, Dwan, and Freddy.
Move your ass, shorty.
They're a little more fleshed out than the original film, though none of the changes affect how the story will unfold. The legal battles and the full-size Kong going wrong were not the film's only problem during production. The director reportedly clashed with the producer, with De Laurentis often siding with the cast and crew over the way that Guillermin interacted with others.
I was wrong when I called this thing a farce. It's a tragedy.
This 1976 film did try to make King Kong relatively grounded and real from a 1970s perspective. When it was released in late 1976, it did reasonably well, though not as well as Jaws the previous year. Its budget in the region of around 20 to 25 million was quite high for the era.
Think positive. Guys who think negative don't get very high up the Petrox Tower.
While a box office haul of about 90 million was respectable enough, Expectations based on the performance of Jaws meant that it was assumed that King Kong would be a monster hit instead of just a monster hit. When the film was ready for television, extra footage was added in to extend the runtime and turn this into a 2-part miniseries. Now that's how I first saw this film a very long time ago. For a while, this was King Kong for me. The original film was an adventure with a lot of monster action but very thin characters. This 1970s update tries to expand the film with more believable characters and succeeds up to a point, though there's possibly less Kong as a result. Another remake followed in 2005, where Peter Jackson followed up his beloved if long trilogy of Lord of the Rings films with a very big budget remake of King Kong, which was less beloved but again very long. It's very much a remake of the original film, just more bestial. That hint of bestiality is baked into the King Kong story.
He risked his life to save me.
Try to rape you, honey.
But the 2005 film does hint at places it would go had it gone for a higher rating. Without a giant Mrs. Kong around on the island, all I can say is stay away from caves.
Jesus.
When this film turned a decent profit, thoughts turned to a potential sequel eventually. It would take 10 years, but King Kong Lives brought back Guillermin to direct and colour Imboldi, but almost everybody else was new. And while it cost a fair bit less in real terms, it was successful-ish, if not exactly a huge hit.
What do you think?
This version of King Kong is solid. It's got a good cast with some epic set pieces, though honestly there's not a whole lot that it does better than a film from 40 years earlier. The only question is, what's with the monkey suit? If you enjoyed this review, please like and subscribe, leave a comment below, or check out some of our other videos. It's similar but different, much like Vegemite and Marmite, which are very similar but different. One is vile and inedible, and the other is Vegemite. Okay, so we're going to record the version for the UK. One is vile and inedible, and the other is Marmite. Okay, so just remember to cut that.